Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another absolutely crazy story time with Phil. Guess what? I actually found a game that doesn't produce enormous file sizes, that doesn't actually require much concentration, allowing me to actually get on with the program. Isn't that fantastic? Anyway, welcome back to another crazy story time with Phil about random stories from history. And today they truly are random, because they're just a couple of stories, 2 or 3 I think, that I have remembered off the top of my head that I'm going to tell you about. And the first one I'm going to tell you about... Whoa! The first thing I'm going to do is nearly throw the microphone off the desk. The first thing I'm going to do is tell you a story that helps me prove a point. And the point that I want to prove to you is that the Eiffel Tower is polygamous. I'll just let that set in for a moment. Okay. Now pick yourself up off the ground and I'm going to tell you what I mean. So if you're not familiar with what polygamy is the practice of having multiple wives.
You need 4 more energy crystals.
I know that. Please shush. Honestly. Okay, so polygamy is having multiple wives. So you might be asking yourself, has this man gone completely stark raving mad? The Eiffel Tower is an enormous piece of metal standing in the middle of Paris. How under the sun can it have any wives? Well, to explain what I mean, we have to go back a long time. We have to go back to the late 1970s, and where we encounter a woman. A woman whose name is called Berliner Mauer, which is a German name. And that name means Berlin Wall. You might remember the Berlin Wall. It was a big wall that existed to divide Berlin after the Second World War. And it was a big wall. And this woman married it. She married the Berlin Wall, and she called herself Mrs. Berlin Wall. Berliner Mauer means Berlin Wall. No, I'm not making this up. This is a real woman, and she really existed, I promise. Small parts of me almost can't believe that she's real, but indeed she is real. Anyway, so you might also know something else about the Berlin Wall, and the fact that it doesn't exist anymore because it got torn down. So the Berlin Wall was torn down in 1979, I believe. I could be mistaken, don't quote me on that. And you can imagine that this woman, Mrs. Berlin Wall, wasn't very pleased about this, because of course her husband had just been ripped down by lots of people. They'd come along and said, I don't like you anymore, Mr. Wall, I'm going to push you over. And they did, and the wall went over, and then that was the end of the Berlin Wall. But she was married to the Berlin Wall, so obviously her husband had basically just been murdered. And this is what she said. I believe she's even written a book about being married to the Berlin Wall, but I'm not sure. It's not a confirmed source that told me that, so don't trust that particular piece of information. But anyway, she was very upset about the fact that her husband had just been, in her eyes, killed, and she was extremely, extremely angry. Which, if my understanding of history is correct, she was pretty much the only person who was angry about the Berlin Wall going down. But never mind. Anyway, this brings us to something a little bit more recent in 2007, where we have an American archer. Yes, she was a sportswoman, and she did archery, the thing with bows and arrows and the such like. So anyway, she was an American archer. Have I written her name down? No, I haven't. Why did I write nobody's names down? Probably because they were too complicated. Anyway, I can remember her surname. Her surname was Mrs. Eiffel Tower. Yes. She married the Eiffel Tower in 2007. She considers herself to be Mrs. Eiffel Tower. Yes, this is an entirely legal circumstance that you can undertake if you want. In fact, you can go and marry the Eiffel Tower. Yes, you. Whoever is watching this video, any single person watching this video, even myself, could go and marry the Eiffel Tower. There is a company in France that specialises in this business. For about $1,250 to $1,500. No, sorry, $1,250 to $2,500. My mistake. They will let you marry the Eiffel Tower. There's a ceremony. There's legal document signing. There's vows. You kiss it. There's everything. You can marry the Eiffel Tower. and numerous people have. To the point where the Eiffel Tower has many, many wives and even a couple of husbands, I think, making the Eiffel Tower polygamous. I'm not ever going to try and turn that story into a joke, because frankly it's so much of a joke in and of itself that I can't do anything with it. On a comedic level, there is nothing that I can do with this material, because it's so absolutely unbelievably absurd in the first place that I can barely wrap my brain around it. I'm not going to go into some sort of a crazy rant about why marrying an inanimate object is absolutely stark raving mad. I'm also not going to bring up the fact that I once heard of a woman who married a fence post. We're going to completely ignore that. We're going to completely ignore this weird psychological phenomenon where people become attracted to inanimate objects. And we're going to move on to the second story, which is about a Roman emperor, because they're always good for a laugh. So, this man was a Roman emperor. He was the bloke in charge of the Holy Roman Emperor, of the Holy Roman Empire, which is a very difficult thing to say if you have a face as bad as mine. So, he was the man in charge of it all. But it's a lot of power, it's a lot of responsibility, and it's a lot of money. And as such, it's quite an attractive job. So there are lots of applicants, you see. There's always lots of people who are applying to be Roman Emperor. And how you apply to be Roman Emperor is by killing the current one, because there is no job application system to go through. They hadn't invented CVs at that point, so instead you just murdered whoever had the job, and then you go to take over. So, naturally, he was quite scared of getting murdered by people who wanted to be Emperor instead. And to this end, he ended up becoming a bit paranoid. Really rather paranoid. To the point where he wouldn't let his guards, yes, his guards, the men who he paid to protect him, get too close to him, in case they were secretly being paid off as assassins. He also had the walls, the marble walls of his palace, polished so bright that he could see himself in them, so that wherever he looked, he could see behind himself to make sure nobody was sneaking up on him. So he was very, very scared. And he also lived on an island. He didn't live in Rome, he didn't live in the city, he lived on a tiny little island off the coast of Italy where he felt marginally more safe. So, we've got our setting. We've got our little island, we've got our Roman Emperor, and we've got our paranoia. Okay, that is fantastic. Come here. That's better. That's fantastic. Okay, so we've got a setting. So, what happened? Well, on this island, he wasn't alone, there were some other people. And there was a fisherman. And this was a man, a Roman man, who went out to do fishing. That was his job, that was his livelihood, that's what he did with his life. And one day, he caught a really big fish, and he thought, wow, this is an amazing fish. This is so fantastic. I know what I should do with this. I should take this fish to the emperor, and I should ask him for his blessing. I should say, can you bless me from the offering that I have given you, which is this great big fish? So he thought, that's a fantastic idea, I shall do that. So I shall walk up to the palace, and I shall request to enter from the guard, so I can go in and say, hello Mr. Emperor, I have brought you this big fish, may you please give me your blessing, which is what he did, because he's the sort of man that gets stuff done, unlike me. So he went to the emperor, but remember, the emperor is very paranoid. He thinks that everyone is trying to kill him. So when this stranger turns up on his doorstep, he thinks he's an assassin, and he's holding a big fish, which he thinks is a murder weapon. It's not, it's a fish, but he thinks it's a murder weapon. So anyway, I almost cannot believe, I genuinely, I cannot believe this story is true, and the words that I'm about to come out of my mouth are true, but apparently they are, so if they're not true, don't blame me, blame the historians. What the emperor did was he took the fish off the man, he gave it to his guard, and he said to the guard, beat this man with this fish. The fisherman was beaten with his offering, which was a big fish. Just imagine that. Men in togas and sandals, in a palatial palace on a tiny Italian island, thousands of years ago, and there's a man on the floor like this, and there's a man above him like this, holding a big fish. I wish I had a fish prop. Do I have anything I could use as a fish prop? Not really. That is a terrible shame. But anyway. And he's beating him. He's beating him and beating him and beating him. To prove that he's not an assassin. I don't personally know how beating somebody proves they're not an assassin, but never mind. So they kept on beating him until he cried out for them to stop. And they did, which is, quite nice of them, I suppose. At which point he said, "I'm very glad I didn't also bring a big crab that I caught as an offering as well. Because earlier in the day, before he'd caught the fish, he caught the crab. A big crab!" So, the Emperor, still believing that he was an assassin, decided... he decided to send his guards around to the man's house to retrieve what he believed was an attempted murder weapon, even though he hadn't actually attempted to murder him. And he had the crab brought to his palace. At which point he then continued to beat the fisherman with the crab as well as the fish. And I suppose the only moral of the story that I can possibly bring to this, from this utterly ridiculousness, is that sometimes, to quote Sigmund Freud, sometimes a big fish being used as an offering for your blessing, Mr. Emperor, is just a big fish being used as an offering for your blessing, Mr. Emperor. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Okay, so the next little bit I'm going to tell you about is 3 little short nuggets of information, because an awful lot of my stories so far have been quite Eurocentric, They've focused quite a lot on Europe, on European leaders, and on the history of Europe, especially the history of the United Kingdom, because obviously that's where I live, it's where I know the most information about. But I want to branch out a little bit and tell you a bit about Asia. I want to tell you 3 little bits of information about Asia that I think will help you know some stuff. Okay, so China. You might know that China used to have emperors, a bit like Rome. They used to have emperors, and the very last emperor of China was a young boy. They didn't have any power left at that point. That had been taken over by the government. They didn't have any power left, and they were basically just a bit like a figurehead, a bit like the monarchy here in the Great Britain. So, the last emperor of China was considered to be very, very special, very, very important, and they needed to look after him. So they kept him in the palace, and they didn't give him much exposure to the outside world. He didn't go to a normal school, he didn't go to the park, he didn't do any of these things, he didn't sing and dance in the streets stark naked like, normal people do, He was protected from these normal things that people do on their usual Saturday nights. I don't know what you do in your Saturdays, but that's certainly what I do. So anyway, he was quite protected, but then again, he was still the emperor, he still had a lot of sway. So if he wanted something, and he wanted to do something or wanted to go somewhere, he still kind of got to go there. His servants just sort of pushed him away from doing that kind of thing. But anyway, one day he said to them, "I would like a phone." You got to understand, this was in the mid-1900s, I think. So phones, it wasn't like, "Oh, can I have a smartphone?" It wasn't that. It was, "Can I have a ring phone?" On a line, like cavemen used, apparently. So anyway, he wanted a phone, and being the emperor, they had to give it to him. So they were thinking, I wonder what he will do. Will he call up foreign leaders and cause political troubles? Will he talk to historians and learn things that we haven't told him? What will he... No. He did it for prank calls and nothing else. He would have huge...
Free to go.
I know, I'm in the middle of a sentence. Please don't interrupt me.
Another energy crystal stored. You're doing great.
Didn't even get to start my sentence. Anyway, where was I? Oh yes, he did nothing but make prank calls. For example, he would ring up a restaurant and say, "Hello, I would like lots and lots and lots of food. Please send it to this address." He wasn't giving the address of the royal palace. He was giving the random address of some random person. And they would have a load of food turn up at their house and they'd have no idea what to do with it, and a huge bill that they didn't know what to do with. Other things he liked to do was to prank call local celebrities, local film stars and writers. He would call them up using silly voices and confuse them. This is how the last emperor of China used his time and his telephone. So, what's the second story? Well, the second story is actually about the current leader of China, President Xi Jinping. So, he's the leader of China's government. He's the big man. He's Daddy Bear, if you like. He's the big bloke who's in charge of China. So, a while ago, some people on the internet started saying that he looked a bit like Winnie the Pooh. Yes, that beloved, timeless children's book character of the yellow bear that likes honey. They started saying that he looked a bit like Winnie the Pooh. And the president didn't really like this very much. He didn't like it at all. To the point where he banned all mention of the character. Mentioning the character on social media is a crime. Saying that he looks anything like him is an even worse crime. I'm not going to go into the politics or the anything of China or anywhere else. I'm simply going to say that any man that bans a beloved children's character simply because some people say he looks a bit like them is stark, raving mad. And, for the record, I would like to say that I think Xi Jinping looks absolutely, categorically identical to Winnie the Pooh. I saw an image showing both of their faces side by side, and I honestly couldn't tell who was who. And if the Chinese government would like to attempt to take down this video, they are very, very welcome to try. And as if I wasn't in enough trouble with Asian governments at the moment, I need to get into some more. And I'm going to tell you about the leader of North Korea. Yes, Kim Jung-un himself, that bloke. So, recently there has been a little bit of, well, I say recently, a little while ago, there has been a bit of a fracas, if you like, a bit of a happenings going on between the North and the South. You see, the North has been finding, people in the North have been finding a lot of flyers. Pieces of paper with words and pictures on them. What are these words and pictures of, you ask? They're of Kim Jong-un and his wife. One of the pictures is his wife in lingerie. And this, he says, all of these flyers have been put into the North from the South. He says the South are printing them and throwing them over the border so that the citizens will pick them up and apparently be indoctrinated by some sort of southern propaganda. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure where stockings come into propaganda. In fact, I'm not at all sure where it comes into. I think if there's anything on Earth that has absolutely no politics attached to it whatsoever, it's legs. But anyway, he thinks that that's terrible. I don't honestly know why. Personally, I think his wife looks kind of good in it, but never mind. You know, that's completely beside the point. The point is what he did with this information. He decided that he really didn't like the South for doing it, so he threatened war. Yes, you know, that man has absolutely loads of nuclear weapons that can hit any part of Earth, apart from South America for some reason. Which is why after making this video I'm going to very swiftly move to Brazil. No, of course not. Of course I'm not going to move to Brazil. He threatened war previously. One of the other times that he threatened war was because the Americans were supplying military weapons, military missile platforms to the South. You might think that's a more sensible thing to go to war over, you know, guns and missiles and Americans and Koreans. You might think, oh, that sounds like the ingredients for a war. You wouldn't think a slightly racy photo of a woman on a piece of paper that's been chucked over a border would quite precipitate war. So you wouldn't quite think that a pair of legs and stockings were quite a reason to go to war. I mean, you've heard of Helen of Troy, you know, the face that launched 1,000 ships, but I've never heard of Mrs. Kim Jong-un, the legs that launched 12 nuclear weapons. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. And again, if the North Korean government and their their friends would also like to attempt to take this video down, they are also more than welcome to try. So anyway, I think that's enough crazy stories from Phil that are frankly unbelievably weird. What am I doing with this format? What am I doing in my life? I'm sitting here playing my favourite game in the world, talking about stockings, polygamous buildings, children's book characters, prank phone calls, and massive crabs. What did I do? How did I get to this point? Can I read my own autobiography that I haven't written? Because I honestly am confused as to how I got here. But anyway, I hope that served some sort of purpose. I hope it was educating. I hope it was interesting of some manner. I hope it was enjoyable. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to my absolute categorical drivel. Look after each other, and good night.